Hi dear audience, hope you would be fine. Today in this short video we would be talking on Unburdening post 9/11 cultural trauma, a comparative study of the selected American and Asian fiction. Myself am Abdul Rashid and this was my PhD project. With that of the introduction of this study means the incident of 9/11. It was both the word changed and the fiction changed against the expectation and historical tradition. America, from being a land of opportunities and exceptionalism, was converted into a land of discrimination against the Muslim as minorities of the America. While on the other hand, the post 9/11 fiction dramatically included the content and characters, keeping in view the suffering of 9/11. Amid such chaotic situation, new tendency of the fiction, with the emphasis on the recovery from such trauma and the sufferings, also emerged. Such fiction contextualized the discourse of terror, trauma, and recovery. Statement of the problem: the American media and the fiction in immediate response to the incident of 9/11 as an agent of meaning making constructed this tragedy as an event of cultural trauma. In such an attempt, the tragedy got a univocal representation, i.e., a tragedy of the American. In this context, Americans were represented as the worst victim of the sufferings followed by this tragedy, while in actual sense the Western and the non-Westerns were equally the victims of this tragedy. The present study insists heavily on the importance of finding new and different narrative, counter-narrative, counter-environment capable of creating complexity with respect to the memory of a traumatic event in order to reframe not only the event but also the divided and unfair memories that inevitably follow that event, in turn leading to the new discrimination. For these reasons, the analysis of the two novels written outside the North American area is particularly interesting and useful in offering alternative point of view outside the place where the trauma experienced in a direct way. As a matter of fact, 9/11 is a date that opens the 21st century in a dramatic way, with the serious repercussions outside the United States, so that it cannot be but a subject for analysis and reflection outside that geographic context. It is in fact a global and globalized trauma experience at the same time by the international community, albeit with the geopolitical different consequences. In the whole world, if the whole world witnessed the collapse of the towers live, in fact, undergoing a mediated experience in the following months, that trauma brought different elaboration and consequences in different realities. However, in the Western world, that trauma reinvigorated identity, stereotypes, cultural discrimination, and most seriously, led to the abuses of power and nullification of the civil liberties and the rights in the realities which were considered as democratic. So the following are the research questions of this study. Following are the major research questions which the study aims to explore. How do the major characters of the selected American fiction try to shake off the construction of cultural trauma in these texts? And second research question is, how are the major characters of the selected Asian fiction involved in the project of rewriting their identity and resistance against the constructed stereotypes? So, significance of the study. This study is certainly timely and useful in recovering nuances of an ongoing trauma that have yet to be explored. Likewise, this project is interesting as it invites to reflect on how literature can play an important role in processing trauma within different but complementary cultural traditions, and very important traditions which have different approaches to the very idea of storytelling as well as the narratological registers. This study is significant as it attempts to look at these aspects which have been muted and marginalized by the Eurocentric American version of suffering. It attempts to decolonize the imperialist conundrum of cultural trauma constructed by the American media in the post-9 era. As the process of cultural trauma is mediated, American national media adopted a reductive approach in dealing with the labeling the sufferings of the American while ignoring the peripheral area of its society, which were majorly the Muslims. The migrant means Muslim trajectories had to face a situation of invisibility, marginalization, and socio manipulations. America could not differentiate between the perpetrators of the tragedy and the innocent Muslims during post 9/11 era. This study is significant as it provides a counter stance that post 9/11 did not change everything for the Americans, but brought a lot of sufferings from the innocent Muslims as well. In this study, we have looked at the trauma theory and post 9/11 fiction in a globalized and decentralized context to argue that 9/11 was not traumatic for the West only. This study is significant as it is an attempt to pave a path of universal peace, harmony, and integration process by eroding the supposed conflicting dichotomies perceived by the American in the post 9/11. This study is significant from the pedagogical perspective as well. It provides new interpretations to the teachers, researchers, and the students interested in the post 9/11 fiction and cultural trauma as an emerging lens in the critical social theory. Then comes the theoretical framework. There are the following reasons for choosing Alexander's proposed model of cultural trauma for our study as a framework. Firstly, it takes the construction of cultural trauma as a process. This process of cultural trauma ends at the point of calming down, which is one of the objectives and the aims of our study. Secondly, it extends its circumference to the inclusion of the trauma of the non-Western world, the trauma of the third world, which is second objective of our study. Cultural trauma refers to the social situation of crisis, fear, and chaos in which the members of a collectivity feels threatened by some erroneous event. Such events cast a long-lasting impact on the social consciousness of that particular group. Such events which qualify for the definition of cultural trauma affect the memories and the identity of the victims significantly. The incident of 9/11 confirms its status as culturally traumatic as it has threatened the collective consciousness of the Americans by making them realize that they can be doomed to destruction in spite of being the dominant global economic, capital, and military supreme power. Thus, the codification of the incident of 9/11 establishes that even America is not a safe social site. This urges that the national societies, social groups, and even sometimes the entire civilization cognitively realize the existence and human sufferings. In a more simple analogy, we can say that the marginalized and the excluded can be a source of trauma for the powerful as well. The incident of 9/11 deconstructed conventional structural binary of powerful and powerless and proved that both marginalized and privileged can be the victim of trauma. This situation identified a charge of moral responsibility to feel the sufferings of excluded and marginalized as well. In the post 9/11 times, America and the rest of the world started thinking this question: is the suffering of others also our own? In thinking that it might be in fact be, societies expanded the circle of we and created the possibility of repairing societies to prevent the trauma from happening again. The present studies aim to trace the victims of 9/11 beyond the borders of America and in the restrictive sense of America and the Western we. In addition, this study has also aimed to trace to what extent the authors of our selected text create the possibility of abridging and repairing the societies in all-inclusive social model of peace and suffering. So our first analysis, the very first novel of our analysis was The Submission by Waldman. When we go through that analysis, we see that Waldman had attempted to unburden cultural trauma constructed by media and political agents as the agents of meaning making through our fiction. In the light of the analyzed data, we find that the Waldman suggested that initially American society, in response to the incident of 9/11, turned into a traumatic society under the process of cultural trauma. However, all the characters of the novels are engaged in unburdening cultural trauma through the social agents in religious, political, aesthetics, and legal domains. Asma, for example, who is the main character of this novel, shakes the general understanding of Americans towards the Muslim. She redefines negatively perceived identities of the Muslim in America. Then the Waldman projects for such a social space in American society that should be capable of adhering to diversity of individuals and collective issues in different domains. The characters of the novel seem actively participating in the process of decoding trauma and routinization. The sense of collateral damage is addressed by the characters of the novel. Waldman suggests that it is the moment for the Americans to focus on the civil rights rather to focus on the stupefied and intensified constructs of cultural trauma, which further generates hatred and social hollowness. She suggests that the names are a record, not a gesture. Waldman poses the question to the world that we cannot erase the history, but we can pave the way for the recovery from the past history. Waldman established that the project of coexistence and mutual understanding, which is more visible at the end of the novel. Waldman develops that such an American society at the end of the novel, which is more open-ended, open-minded, and is willing to heal and recover from the constructs of cultural trauma. Then is the second novel of analysis, The Memory of the Things. It is more a story about how America in the post 9/11 times keeps on going, keep moving forward. How did they attempt to heal? The Memory of Things eventually becomes a story of a symbolized girl from America who is crouched in fear, covered with the ashes, and with a pair of playful costume wings. We come to see a narrative where people redeem one another by small gestures, a story where people have no choice but to keep on going in the face of the huge tragedy and unspeakable loss. This is not a post 9/11 story, but a coming of the age story, one about healing and love. We see that Plisner, in the backdrop of trauma of 9/11, has created an appraising picture of the American society that through the major characters in the novel were under serious traumatic situation. But with the passage of time, they started to heal and stabilize. In the time of this crisis, the survivors have no other options except to pick up the pieces and go on living. All the characters of the novel adopt the strategy of coping with the trauma. The novel projects a hope of living among the tragedy. The characters are still living in the love and hope in spite of the fact that all building had gone. The characters of the novel adopt love as a coping strategy to overcome the stress of the tragedy. In spite of living among the social chaos, all the characters get for what they have been worried and striving as a lot during the chaos of the tragedy of 9/11. We see that the tragic incident had bowed down the towers but not the will of the characters to live. Then is the third our novel of analysis, Homeboy. The incident of 9/11, American society in religious and political terms was hostile to the Muslim on account of its Orientalist binaries. The identity of the Muslim was constructed as berated and negative. The Muslims in America, even before the incident of 9/11, were taken as an invisible enemy of America. But after the incident of 9/11, it can be observed that the Western media consciously developed a discourse of terrorism against the Muslims to justify its national and political stigmas. Thus, the situation of social exclusion aggravated against the Muslims. The Muslims had to face social discrimination and scrutinization in the name of the war against terror. The phenomenon of multiculturalism made it complex for the American to differentiate between the identities of the innocent victim of the incident of 9/11 and the perpetrator of this tragedy. The post 9/11 world was divided into us versus them, the model of social discrimination, and raised the situation of collective consciousness. In response to this raised consciousness, the Muslim felt it necessary to write back as a strategy to redefine their distorted identities. The Western constructed discourse of terrorism is more based on prejudice than on the reality. The discursive practices of Western discourse enabled the Muslims to develop counter-narrative to establish their self and identity against misrepresentation of their identity. On the account of their position as other, the Muslim characters spoke for themselves by engaging in the rationale to redefine what it is meant to be as a practicing Muslim. Most importantly, it is established that the impression of the Muslims as the terrorist, for example, this was an analogy, Muslims are the terrorists, Chuck is a Muslim, which was the central character in the novel The Homeboy. As Chuck is a Muslim, so Chuck is a terrorist. Furthermore, it emerged from the analysis that the analysis of the fractured identities are more able to rewrite their identity and self against the dominant modes of representation. Naqvi equates that until America continues practicing Orientalist modes, the counter narrative as a strategy of resistance would continue. Naqvi suggests that the American discourse against terrorism is constructed on one and the collective consciousness of the Muslims for their identity is natural. Then is our last novel for the analysis, with the novel The Last Illusion visualizes the invisible structural inequality prevalent in American society. It suggests the productive reimagining in American society so that America may come out of the communal violence which resulted in the tragedy of 9/11. There is a dire need of developing the ways to rethink against the registered violence and chaos which led America to chaos and trauma. The novel projects that as America could not maintain itself to the social and democratic values, so it collapsed on 9/11. The novel suggests that to avoid the collision of both on the individual and cultural level, it is necessary to maintain a social collective across national identities to avoid devastation. The novel Last Illusion represents that American culture has converted more into a social site of chaos. Zal, who is the main character of this novel, consistently strives for the possibility of future in the New York, which unfortunately ends by the end of the novel. To conclude the argument, we see that the assertion of the novel The Lost Illusion as a move towards recovery from the construction of cultural trauma is appealing. Moving towards our findings, in conclusion, we may conclude that these selected texts of the current study counterbalance and aid in the correction of the more simplistic application of the trauma paradigm that was initially hijacked by media and the country leaders by their capacity to evaluate the impact of 9/11 across numerous contexts and through a variety of perspectives. These texts protect against the narrow co-opting of the trauma trope while prioritizing the richness of the 9/11 incidents. In response to this social construction of cultural trauma, significant changes in identity revisions come into force. This reconstruction affects the memory and makes the concept of the self as fluid and social. So, the reconstructing process of collective identity flattens out the aggression in society, and liminality gives way to the aggression and helps in reducing the clashes. As the heightened and powerful affective discourse of trauma disappears, the lessons of trauma becomes objectified in monuments, museums, and the collections of historical artifacts. The process of reconstruction, representation, and working through the productive, significant commemoration, rituals, and reconstruction of the national identity. In the light of the analyzed text, we can conclude that in the post 9/11 fiction, the only media was not a discursive agent as of the creating discourse of conflict between America and the Muslims. There were some other career groups which, under the influence of media and political ideology, had been working to maintain the status of incident as 9/11 as a culturally traumatic. In parallel, there were the same characters who had attempted to unburden the incident of 9/11 from the status of cultural trauma. We see that the Muslim characters had been in the constant struggle in rewriting their identity and self. The characters in the Asian fiction have attempted to unburden the stereotypes of the Americans. The fiction writers, as an agent of meaning making, urged for a third space in which the people with the different identities may live. Media has been privileged and endorsing the meaning making agent, but fiction counter narrated the reality projected by media. In the light of this study, we see where media and other members of the community were involved in labeling the incident of 9/11 as culturally traumatic. At the same time, there were some other members of the community who have been actively engaged in unburdening the incident of 9/11 as culturally traumatic. They have consciously been engaged in forgetting the memory of the incident of 9/11 from the memory of the American nation. Such characters projects that unless and until we do not erase the memory of the incident of 9/11 from our cultural and national archetypes, we are unable to maintain peace and mutual coexistence. To conclusion, I can establish that the selected texts urge for a socially inclusive model, the suffering of the East and the West equally. All the characters of the selected novel suggest that The incident of 9/11 was such a fire which brought loss and suffering to both to the east and the west. All the novelists suggest that the suffering does not belong to some specific geographies and individuals. All the texts suggest that America should come out of such burdens of representation, which are difficult to be carried out and performed. With this, goodbye. Thank you.